session this afternoon, each day, we're going to move to what's called the compassion wing of practice. As I mentioned yesterday evening, in all Buddhist traditions, the three core areas of practice are ethics, concentration, and wisdom. Or another way of saying that is, on the basis of ethics, to engage in shamatha and vipassana practices. And if we put a lot of effort into shamatha and vipassana and only do those practices, we can become quite self-absorbed, disconnected from the world. So we need to make sure that they are balanced. So here in this retreat, Shamatha retreat, we're going to balance with the compassion wing. And we're going to do that by looking at what I call the four immeasurables practices. Four qualities that we're cultivating for ourselves and others. Loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And so what I'd like to do today is to look at the first of those, loving kindness. Loving kindness is a translation of the Sanskrit word maitri and the Pali word metta. And loving kindness is simply the wish for ourselves and others to be happy. Or in other words, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. So what we can see here is that loving kindness is not an emotion. It's an aspiration, it's a wish. So therefore, it's probably better to translate maitri and metta as loving kindness rather than as love. Sometimes it's translated as love. Because love, I think generally in the English language, is an emotion, and often it implies some sort of intimate behaviour. Whereas here, maitri and metta is not an emotion. It's an aspiration, it's a wish. So therefore I think it's better to translate that as loving kindness rather than love. Now most of us already have, of course, an aspiration or desire to be happy. But often our aspiration for happiness is misdirected. Meaning that we often not only don't we find happiness, but we often induce a lot of unnecessary suffering on ourselves in our striving for happiness. And this is very nicely summarized by great Indian Buddhist master Shantideva in the 8th century. He says, "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." So if we want to cultivate this loving kindness for ourselves and others, this wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes, then we need to know, what is happiness? What do we mean by happiness? What are the causes of that happiness? And then how do we cultivate those causes? Because if we don't know those three things, then this trying to cultivate loving kindness, it's just words which really have no meaning. So let's have a look at those three things. What is happiness? What are the causes of happiness? And how do we cultivate those causes? So we can talk about two types of happiness, what's called temporal happiness and genuine happiness. Temporal happiness is another name for our pleasurable experiences. So our pleasurable experiences, of course, are what's called stimulus-based, meaning we receive some stimulus, some sort of stimulus, and we have a pleasant experience. So therefore, this type of happiness is often called conditioned happiness. Meaning certain conditions need to come together and then we have the happiness experience. So with this temporal happiness then, because it's conditioned happiness, it means it's unstable, meaning when the stimulus finishes, the pleasurable experience finishes. And also, because it's a stimulus-based happiness, it's unreliable, meaning we can't just have a pleasant experience whenever we want one. We require a certain stimulus. If there's no stimulus, there's no pleasant experience. And if we look closely at our pleasurable experiences, we'll come to see that our pleasurable experiences are not really even in the nature of happiness. Because if our pleasurable experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean the more we would engage in those pleasant experiences, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience that if we overindulge in our pleasurable experiences, not only don't we become more happy, we often induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. For example, eating too much of our favourite dessert, staying too long out there in the nice warm sunshine. So what we can understand is that our pleasurable experiences are relative experiences. Relative to some earlier state, they're an improvement, but if we overindulge in these pleasurable experiences, they often turn into suffering themselves. So this is the first type of happiness, temporal happiness, or another name for our pleasurable experiences. Then we can talk about what's called genuine happiness, a state of inner well-being. And this is not stimulus-based, meaning we don't require any particular stimulus to be in this state of happiness. So therefore, this is called unconditioned happiness, meaning we don't require certain conditions to come together for us to be in that state. So we can be in that state of inner well-being regardless of what is going on around us. And so therefore, because this is unconditioned happiness, it's stable, reliable, and in the nature of happiness. So therefore, when we talk about this in loving kindness, the wish or aspiration for happiness and its causes, we're mainly talking, of course, about genuine happiness. That we are aspiring to genuine happiness. Now, what we tend to do, of course, now is that we conflate those two, meaning we are hoping that the first one will give us the second one. So we tend to hope or want our pleasurable experiences to give us some sort of lasting, genuine happiness. And as a result, then we end up with craving and attachment to our pleasant experiences, trying to hold on to them, make them last, hoping that they'll really satisfy us and really make us happy. So, of course, when we have craving and attachment to our pleasant experiences, with that often comes worry and anxiety about not getting that thing, not getting enough of it, or losing it. And then also what comes with craving and attachment is frustration when we don't get it. And then when we do get it, often that leads to overindulging and thereby simply causing more suffering. And then, of course, when that pleasurable experience finishes, that craving and attachment often leads to a lot of dissatisfaction, disappointment, when things don't really live up to our expectations. And then we think that the problem is, I just didn't get enough of it, so we end up with more craving, trying to get more. And so the whole cycle continues. And then, of course, craving and attachment is never satisfied, because those pleasurable experiences can never satisfy us fully. So therefore, we end up losing out on the things we used to enjoy. And we know this from our own experience. If there's something we enjoy in our life, but we get it too often, then after a while, craving and attachment goes, sorry, that's not good enough anymore. I want something bigger, better, and different. So craving and attachment is always looking for something bigger, better, and different. Never satisfied. So here then, if we don't conflate them, if we don't hope the first one is going to give us the second one, if we understand that actually there are two types of happiness, pleasurable experiences and genuine happiness, then we can strive for that genuine happiness. And as a side effect, actually enjoy our pleasurable experiences much more. Because often, when we hear some Buddhist teachings on this topic, people often mistakenly think it's a choice. Either I have to choose pleasure or genuine happiness. And that, of course, is a misconception, a misunderstanding. And I think part of the reason that comes about is that often in this context in Buddhism, we often hear this word renunciation. That actually, to enter the Buddhist path, to strive for this goal of genuine happiness, we need to develop this mind called renunciation. And of course, renunciation is coming from the word to renounce or to give up. And so when people hear this, they mistakenly think what they need to give up is their pleasurable experiences. That they need to give up their money, their wealth, their possessions, their pleasurable experiences, that these somehow what we need to give up. That often people think this renunciation